All right, the Dow right now accelerating its losses. We're down about 688 points. You want to join me at the close at 4 p.m. on Fox Business Network. We'll tell you how it finished. I'm Melissa Francis in today for Harris Faulkner. The Daily Briefing is next.
Could a Washington summit with Russia's President Putin be in the works? Moscow saying President Trump brought up the idea last month. The White House saying there's nothing set in stone. Hello, everyone. I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Daily Briefing. The Kremlin highlighting the president's suggestion for a summit as both countries engage in diplomatic expulsions. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts is live on the North Lawn. Hi, John. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too, Dana. It's a day there's so much happening here. Where to begin? But Russia's as good a place as any. The president and the White House now considering the idea of where to hold a summit meeting between President Trump and President Putin. No plans are being made, but the invitation was extended during a March 20th phone call that President Trump put into President Putin to congratulate him on winning the election. Should the two of them meet, it would be the first time that Putin has met with the U.S. president on American soil since 2015, the first time at the White House since November of 2001. U.S. and Russian presidents also often meet on the sidelines of major conferences. The last time President Trump and President Putin met for any sort of length of time was at the G20 summit in Hamburg. There are no conferences that are going to happen that would bring the two leaders in the same place at the same time until November. So any meeting that they had would have to be a specially arranged bilateral meeting. The White House and Russia in a diplomatic tit for tat right now. Tensions are high over the announced expulsion of some 60 Russian diplomats and intelligence operatives from the United States in response to that nerve agent attack in the UK. Russia announcing that it was going to kick out a bunch of American diplomats. But a Kremlin spokesman holding out hope of a thaw, saying that a meeting, quote, would be rather important and beneficial for both countries as well as for the entire global community. Serbia, by the way, has stepped in to say, wouldn't it be great if the two leaders could meet in Belgrade? We'd be happy to arrange that. The president, meantime, taking aim at the FBI again and the Department of Justice for not yet fully complying with a request from oversight committees in Congress for documents related to the Inspector General's investigation into possible wrongdoing at the highest levels during the 2016 election. The president tweeting, quote, so sad that the Department of Justice and the FBI are slow walking or not even giving the unredacted documents requested by Congress, an embarrassment to our country. FBI Director Christopher Wray did say recently that he is doubling the number of FBI personnel working on document production. He hopes to speed that up. The president also taking aim at reports of a caravan of Honduran nationals making its way through Mexico, heading for the U.S. border. The president sending a message to them and people in Central America, including these so-called coyotes that move people up toward the United States, to say that there are no protections in place, no DACA deal that could potentially give them a path to citizenship. But the president also taking the opportunity, while he's sending that message, to whack the Democrats for not cutting a deal to preserve DACA protections for the so-called Dreamers. Listen to what the president said at the Easter egg roll.
Democrats have really let them down. They've really let them down. They had this great opportunity. The Democrats have really let them down. It's a shame. And now people are taking advantage of DACA, and that's a shame.
Sources here at the White House tell me that the president was briefed on the caravan of Hondurans by the DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen late last week, which is why this is suddenly top of mind for him. We're also waiting to hear from the White House this week on which Chinese goods are going to be targeted for U.S. tariffs. Lindsay Walters, the deputy press secretary here, saying China's subsidization and continued overcapacity is the root cause of the steel crisis. Instead of targeting fairly traded U.S. exports, China needs to stop its unfair trading practices, which are harming U.S. national security and distorting global markets. Lindsay Walters there referring to tariffs that China has announced on some $3 billion worth of American goods, including fruits and pork. So China willing to go to the mat here in a trade war. And Dana, just in case that wasn't enough, I just got word that the EPA is going to call to revise CAFE and auto emissions standards for cars and light trucks. They have completed what's called the midterm evaluation process. They say the process that the Obama administration engaged in several years ago was flawed. and they're going to do it all over again, which is going to make automobile makers happy that they don't have to meet the strict regulations that the Obama administration had suggested.
And no
Dana.
doubt it will add a lot more litigation, as California probably will reject that. Just one question, John. When it comes to a meeting with Putin, really it is important, I think, that these two countries, ours and Russia, have some discussions before November, because just in the next month, you have big decisions that have to be made on the Iran deal. You have the upcoming potential talks between the United States and North Korea, and the Syria issue. All of those are super important, and Russia has a role to play.
Yeah, which is why the president said in his March 20th Oval Office meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, that he had talked to Putin on the telephone and that the two of them would be meeting soon. I was just making the point that it's likely that they wouldn't meet on the sidelines of any kind of big conference because there aren't any planned for November, so they're going to have to arrange something specific. Syria could be a possibility. There's a lot of other places they could do it as well. But seeing Putin here in Washington certainly would be an interesting image.
Oh, yeah, that would get a lot of attention. All right, John Roberts, thank you.
Anything else I can do for you? Is that it?
I think we'll take it from there. So a down day on Wall Street after China retaliates for President Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs. Right now, we're looking at almost 50 points, 750 points down on the day so far. This after China announcing a series of new tariffs on 128 U.S.-made products, including 15% on a wide variety of goods from agricultural items to stainless steel pipes and modified ethanol. There's also a 25% tariff on 7 types of pork and on steel scraps. Let's bring in Daniel Henninger. He's deputy editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal and a Fox News contributor. There's always upsides and downsides to any policy decision, and I think we're seeing at least one today play out on the stock market.
Yeah, it looks like mostly downside today, Dana. We're not seeing too much upside. I mean, a 750, the stock market looks to be basically in a free fall. And, you know, this is Donald Trump's world. He is the great disruptor, and he initiated the possibilities of these trade tariffs and decided that he would do that, let the world adjust to his commitment to do that sort of thing, and now the world is adjusting. The Chinese have decided, and make no mistake about it, the Chinese deserve to be targeted or at least attacked for some of their trade practices. Nonetheless, they are now reacting, pointedly targeting our pork producers and fruit and vegetable producers, most of whom are in the Midwest and most of whom are in Trump states, and most of whom export enormous amounts of pork and foodstuffs to China.
In fact, listen to this hog farmer, Jeff Rader, who talked about that very thing earlier today.
We're looking forward to more profits this year than last year because of the tax cut. Hopefully we don't have to give it all away due to the tariffs.
China and some of those people are major places we export pork, where if we can't get rid of it, we can't get rid of it in the United States, our market's going to go down.
One of the things, you know, it's one thing on the market is about, let's see, for farm goods exported to China, $20 billion every year. Pork is about $1.1 billion out of $115 billion of goods that we export over there. So relatively speaking, it might seem small, but if you're a farmer and you operate on small margins and you love the tax cut that you got earlier this year, you do run the risk of it basically being wiped out by this.
No question. And as that pork farmer just noted, they have nowhere else to go with their pork if they can't export it to China. The Chinese, however, if they're cut off from U.S. pork, have other sources, say Brazil or Argentina. That's the way global trade markets are very sophisticated now, and they can turn and go elsewhere. Our pork and fruit producers are going to have a very difficult time selling their goods. And, you know, Dana, the Chinese are very sophisticated. Do not for a moment think they made up these tariffs last week. They've seen this coming for the better part of a year. They have a strategy that they're going to initiate in response to the Trump tariffs. And the question is, do we have as sophisticated a strategy at our end to deal with the Chinese?
And that is a good question. I mean, there is the World Trade Organization. You can take your case before the WTO. The United States actually does quite well when it brings those cases. It does take a little bit longer. It's not as big of a blockbuster type of news event. The Chinese, as you said, they deserve a lot of criticism, especially for the theft of intellectual property, which President Trump and the administration is trying to correct. But in the meantime, do you think that working with our allies, if we were to go together as a group to the WTO, that we might be able to do this without escalating a trade war?
I do, Dana. I think to get involved in a trade dispute over all of these issues with China is undeniably going to require the support of our allies. It's going to take tremendous U.S. leadership. But at the moment, I don't see too many of these Western European countries or Australia being willing to sacrifice any of their commercial relationship with China. I mean, it is huge for those countries. And the United States is going to have to be in a leadership position. And at the moment, it looks like it's basically bilateral. That's the President Trump's idea, that most of these trading relationships should be bilateral. He pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership for that reason. So our partners are on the sidelines at the moment, at a moment when I think we're going to need them if we're going to successfully take on China in this area.
Our friend Larry Kudlow has his first day on the job today at the White House as the new economic advisor to the president. Will he have his work cut out for him?
He has his work very much cut out for him. He has to protect the president's almost legacy initiative, which is a strong economy as a result of the tax cuts. When Larry Kudlow shows up and on the first day of work, the stock market goes off 750 points, God knows where it's going to end up. The message to Larry Kudlow is, your growth agenda here needs protecting. And so he's going to have to be in there having this conversation with the president, with his trade rep, Robert Lighthizer, about don't push this trade war so far that you put the growth agenda at risk.
And we know that we have another week before Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, announces his list of possible items with which we would increase tariffs on China. So this story is not over. Dan Henninger, thank you.
Good to be with you, Dana.
All right. President Trump firing off a salvo of tweets saying a deal on DACA is off the table and threatening to walk away from NAFTA. So what happens next? Plus, Nancy Pelosi taking a star turn in Republican campaign ads ahead of the midterms. Is this a good strategy for the GOP? A lot for our panel to debate right after the break.
Mexico has got to help us at the border. And a lot of people are coming in because they want to take advantage of DACA. And we're going to have to really see. They had a great chance. The Democrats blew it. They had a great chance. But we'll have to take a look.
President Trump yesterday blaming Democrats for blocking a deal to protect Dreamers. Today he's tweeting, DACA is dead because the Democrats didn't care or act, and now everyone wants to get onto the DACA bandwagon. No longer works. Must build wall and secure our borders with proper border legislation. Democrats want no borders, hence drugs and crime. Joining us to discuss this, Mo Elleithee, former communications director for the DNC and executive director at Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Policy, and Leon Wolf, managing editor for The Blaze. Let me start with you, Leon. I don't think that there was any thought that there would actually be a DACA deal before the midterms anyway, because basically all the legislation is done for the most part through the year. And also the federal courts have told the president you have to continue with the program as it was. And so it becomes more of a campaign issue than an actual legislative one.
Yeah, you know, this has realistically been dead for weeks, ever since they initially took it up in February. And I do think it is important to remember how we got here. You know, Chuck Schumer did offer to essentially pay for the wall in exchange for, you know, a DACA deal. Now, you can be skeptical about whether he would have actually delivered votes on that deal, but he did offer it. And, you know, what kind of threw, you know, a fly in the ointment was the White House insisting upon kind of dramatically lowering the levels of legal immigration. And from that point on, the whole legislative process was dead on DACA. So, yeah, right now it is essentially just a campaign issue, and I don't know that it's really going to be all that effective for either side. On Republicans, just because I think most of the country, something like 70% of the country, wants the DACA recipients to stay here. But for Democrats, it's just not a high priority issue for a lot of people. That's just not what a lot of people are going to go to the polls and vote for one way or the other. So it really is just campaign rhetoric, I think, at this point.
So, Mo, in the omnibus, basically there was $25 billion authorized for the wall, but only about $1.6 billion actually appropriated. And that, I think, is what has really frustrated the president and some of his supporters, that there was basically a head fake there and he didn't get the money that he wanted. To Leon's point, though, on the DACA issue, is it a motivator for Democrats to get out and vote?
Look, I think both sides are going to try to use this as a motivator for their respective bases. You got to remember that the wall was what brought one of the issues that brought Donald Trump to the dance. His base is very committed to it. But you got to look on the other side. where Democrats are and the most progressive voters are incredibly energized to protect the DACA recipients. So I think both sides are going to try to use this as a campaign issue, but for the president to call it dead at this point, I think it's more downside for him politically than it is upside.
Well, and of course, he could declare it dead today, but then that might be also, I mean, perhaps that's part of the art of the deal.
Yeah.
In the meantime, the Republicans and Democrats are gearing up for the midterms, and Nancy Pelosi is being featured once again as a star in the ads, especially that Republicans are running against Democrats. 34% of Republican ads in the House feature Nancy Pelosi. That was only 9% in 2016 and 13% in 2014, which is interesting because I think Republicans believe this will really work for them. But Mark Mellman, who's a Democratic pollster, was quoted saying this: "It doesn't really add anything to the power of the attack. It's like saying you're a Democrat. I think it's a relative waste of their time, effort, and energy. They are trying to make up for their own problems." Mo, do you think that Nancy Pelosi is a big problem for Democrats, or like with Conor Lamb, can it be surmounted?
Yeah, look, I mean, they are Republican candidates are welcome to spend their money however they want. But I'm kind of with Mark Mellman on this one. I don't see what it's really going to get them. It's not like Republicans haven't been trying to turn her into a campaign issue in some of these special elections. And it's just not driving the narrative. I can't think of a midterm election where the minority leader in the House becomes the defining issue. This election is going to be a referendum on President Trump in many ways. I can see why Republicans want to change that subject, but I don't see this being the thing that does it.
Well, it might be a really good tool, actually, Leon, to get the base out to vote. But younger voters are saying that they're more enthusiastic about voting this year than they have been in the past. Can they be convinced that Nancy Pelosi is a reason to get out and vote against the Democrats?
Well, I mean, it's doubtful. I mean, look, Republicans had a lot of success running against Nancy Pelosi in 2010, but there's a very simple reason for that. She had just been Speaker of the House for 4 years. It's now been over 8 years since she was Speaker of the House. People just don't remember. And it reminds me, Republicans tried to run against her in 2006, scaring people about the possibility of Nancy Pelosi becoming Speaker of the House. And it's not effective without a concrete reminder of what it is. If I were advising Republicans, I would say, look, the Democrats are running almost entirely on being anti-Trump. I think they're really hurting themselves by not having a coherent message that's not, we're not Donald Trump. I think Republicans have an opportunity to say, look, the economy is doing well, and more importantly, people feel like the economy is doing well. I would run positive ads on that and ignore this kind of old playbook about Nancy Pelosi, because I don't think that it's going to be effective in terms of scaring people in this midterm election.
And every strategist nods and then shakes their head and says, negative always wins, unfortunately. All right, Mo Alethi and Leon Wolf, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So he gained notoriety for his defense in a deadly drunk driving case. Now an update on the Texan dubbed the Affluenza teen. Plus, the president threatening to halt aid to Syria, what that could mean for the war-torn region.
When it comes to Syria, do not read the Obama playbook. This is the Obama playbook. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. This is a disaster in the making.
The Texas man known for the infamous Affluenza defense in a deadly drunken driving case has been released from jail. 20-year-old Ethan Couch, a free man, after serving 2 years for violating probation. Couch was put on probation after killing 4 people in 2013 when he was 16 years old. A psychologist helped him avoid prison time then by testifying that his wealthy upbringing helped keep him from determining right from wrong. Officials confirming the death toll is now up to 18 Palestinians after last week's protests on the Gaza-Israeli border. The count rising as officials in Israel deny allegations that troops used unlawful deadly force on unarmed demonstrators. The Gaza protest appears to be the deadliest in the area in years. So Connor Powell, live in Jerusalem with more. Connor.
Yeah, Dana, in addition to those 18 Palestinians that were killed, more than 750 were actually injured on Friday's protest that took place along the Israeli-Gaza security fence. Now, Israeli officials are fending off questions and complaints and criticism by the international community about whether or not they were targeting unarmed civilians. There are videos circulating on social media of Palestinians who are unarmed, who are kneeling and walking away from the border fence when they are being hit by live ammunition. Israeli politicians had had warned last week before the protest that demonstrators would be dealt with by force if they got near the fence. And there are some Palestinians that we saw when we were down there that were lighting tires on fire and also throwing Molotov cocktails. But we also saw Palestinians go down who were pretty far away from the fence, much farther away from the fence than the 200 meters or so that the Israelis had said. So the question really is whether or not the Israeli soldiers were using force even when they were not at risk. That's sort of the big question right now. The Israelis are fending off questions from the EU and the UN. The White House, for their part, has relatively remained silent, Dana.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Connor, was the president is making a decision to halt humanitarian aid to Syria, the tune of $200 million. How's that being received in the region?
Yeah, that came out of sort of nowhere. Former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson announced this $200 million in what they call stabilization funds about a month or so ago. This is money for rebuilding roads, rebuilding sewer systems, demining fields. The idea behind it was to try to rebuild Syria as quickly as possible so that there really isn't a vacuum there, and there isn't an area where jihadists and other militants can return to try to get things up and running there. This surprised a lot of people. It's backed by Secretary Mattis and a lot of the other people at the State Department who think that these type of stabilization funds are a necessity for stabilizing Syria. It's not clear why President Trump made this announcement, but he also said in the last couple of days that he wants to get American troops out of Syria. So it looks like there could be a big shift coming on America's Syria policy right now.
Well, we'll keep in touch with you on that. Thank you, Connor. So we are following new developments in the aftermath of the fatal police shooting of a black man in Louisiana, which sparked massive unrest in the state capitol. Plus this.
I am here today with my classmates because we have been sorely underrepresented and in some cases misrepresented.
As white students dominate the media spotlight in Parkland, Florida, their African-American classmates say they feel left out of the conversation. Will their voices be heard?
When someone watches the news, they want someone they can trust. Our job is to cut through the talking points.
We're going to ask the tough questions because there's a lot of conventional wisdom out there that needs to be challenged.
What I'm doing is making sure that whatever is developed through the day, people are fully informed from coast to coast.
We're 24/7 news, but we're really down to the minute.
We're going to be fearless. We're going to be fair.
Whether it's 4 a.m. or midnight, we're there.
Tensions remain high in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We're told protesters are heading for the office of the state's attorney general. This after he announced last week there will be no charges for 2 white police officers in the shooting death of Alton Sterling, a black man who was selling CDs on the street. Casey Stiegel is live in Dallas with more. Casey.
Yeah, Dana, we were down in Baton Rouge all last week, in fact. Very upset members of that community still, and that's why we're seeing protests continuing this week. A group of about 30 or so, not a huge crowd, but they have made their way inside to the Attorney General's office there in Louisiana. Let's show you video now coming to us. This is what it looks like on the scene. The president of the local NAACP chapter says that they are going to be meeting there every single day until they take the case before a grand jury. Last week, the AG's office said it concluded its investigation into the 2016 shooting of Alton Sterling. The state says there was not enough evidence to criminally charge officers Blaine Salamone and Howie Lake. Salamone was fired and Lake was suspended for 3 days. New surveillance and body cam video was also released, and it shows the deadly altercation. Those officers were responding to a call of a man brandishing a gun outside of the convenience store. When they arrived, it escalated quickly. They attempted to tase Sterling twice. When they said he would not comply, moments later, gunshots, and the father of 5 was dead on the ground. This prompted protests in Baton Rouge. Last year, the U.S. Department of Justice deemed there to be no civil rights violations, and now the city's police chief is hoping to bring closure to the case, while Sterling's family maintains their loved one was murdered in cold blood.
We're speaking because they can't speak for themselves. And we want this entire community to know what happened that July 5th night was wrong. And it was wrong, not because Alton Sterling was the person who was out of control. The police department was out of control. Somebody has to be held accountable for it.
Sterling's family says that they are pursuing a civil lawsuit now, but they are again upset that the Attorney General never even brought the case before a grand jury so peers could hear it. So that is something that they're calling for, although the AG, Dana, says the investigation is wrapped up, both federally and now at the state level.
All right. Important story. Casey Stiegel, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
The issue of race also surfacing in the Parkland High School shooting. Student protesters rallied against gun violence after that tragedy, putting them in the national spotlight. Last week, their African-American classmates held a news conference saying they have been talking about gun violence and police-involved shootings for a long time, but that no one was listening.
The Black Lives Matter movement has been addressing this topic since the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. Yet we have never seen this kind of support for our cause, and we surely do not feel that the lives or voices of minorities are valued as much as those of our white counterparts.
We are proud to say that we're from Douglas. We are proud to say that those who are in the front are doing a great job. But we also, as you can see, have so much to say.
Indeed they do. Joining me now is Noah Rothman, associate editor at Commentary Magazine. Noah, a Wall Street Journal NBC poll showed that 60% of African Americans know someone affected by gun violence. 32% of whites and 44% of Hispanics said the same. And you wrote a piece last week that really caught my eye, and this was before the news had come out about Alton Sterling and that decision in Louisiana. But you talk about the other forgotten America and the coming backlash. What made you want to write that?
It was actually after the amount of attention that was heaped on the revival of the Roseanne Barr program, Roseanne. It struck me as though this was framed as cultural commentary, as the forgotten America, the middle America that delivered Donald Trump a victory in the presidential race, had received outsized attention. And issues like Alton Sterling and Stephon Clark in California and Danny Ray Thomas in Texas, both in the last week, shootings of unarmed black men, would not generate the same amount of attention today as they would 2 years ago. And to me, this is the result of an erroneous perception, I believe, on the part of the press, but also in the political class, that it's a zero-sum game. That if you're focusing on this forgotten America, you're doing short shrift to this other forgotten America, and incubating the kind of backlash that we saw materialize in 2016. And we're incubating another backlash right under our noses and aren't seeing it.
Yeah, you wrote that it would serve the country well to stop gauging the value of group grievances by virtue of their electoral potency. Donald Trump's forgotten America was done an injustice by elites on the coast who would have preferred to go on ignoring them forever. One injustice is not remedied by another. In overcompensating, we are sowing the seeds for a backlash. And what do you think that might, how will that manifest itself?
Well, it'll begin with electoral prowess, again demonstrating that Barack Obama's coalition may not be as moribund as we thought it to be. But it will also come with an agenda that perhaps is a little bit more aggrieved than it would be had we begun a process and a dialogue today. And I don't want that process, that backlash, to be hostile. It should be mutually beneficial, and it can be, but only insofar as we address it now.
Do you think, I'll just say, I shouldn't ask you. I'll say I think that President Trump could actually be in a unique position to reach out to that community as well, right? So he understood that there was a forgotten America, and he reached out to them, and they responded. I think he's in a good position to do that with these folks as well.
Absolutely. He could, just because of the trust that he has with his particular demographic, with his base voters. There are very few things that he can't do, that he could do rather, that would alienate them. So he has the capacity to keep that stable base of voters and enlarge his coalition of voters by reaching out to other demographics through, for example, immigration reform. He could probably, few other presidents could manage immigration reform. He can also affect something like a rapprochement with the Black Lives Matter movement, if he was interested in that sort of gesture.
And last week on The Daily, the podcast that I listened to, there were some young African-American students from Chicago who joined in that March for Our Lives group, and they said, you know, this happens to us every day, and we would like for you to pay attention to us, and I think President Trump is positioned to do that. Noah Rothman, thanks for being here today. He's also called the most dangerous man in America earlier today. You can look that up. All right, Seattle police are using the kind of law people called for after the Parkland shooting to seize weapons from gun owners believed to be a danger to themselves or others. Dan Springer is live in Seattle. So, Dan, how is this red flag play working in Seattle?
Well, Dana, voters in Washington state passed it overwhelmingly in 2016. It kicked in last July, and so far the reviews are overwhelmingly positive. In Seattle, which is one of the few police departments pursuing these court orders, 27 guns have been seized from 16 people. There have been no big confrontations, and no one has claimed their rights have been violated. Army veteran Alexander McKenzie is a pretty good example. He's being treated for PTSD and was acting strange recently, staring at people while carrying his handgun. Police petitioned for an extreme risk protection order, or ERPO. They got the order and soon had the gun. McKenzie told us he was grateful, and he's not alone.
We've had 3 individuals that have specifically thanked us after the execution of the ERPO order because, to their admission, they agreed that it was probably not a good idea that they had firearms in play.
6 states have these high-risk or red flag laws in play, but the Brady campaign says up to 30 more states are considering them. There is plenty of due process built in. One family or family members or roommates or police can petition for the civil order. The burden of proof is on them to show the person is a danger to himself or others. If the order is granted, the guns can be taken away right away, but the gun owner gets to make his case in court within 2 weeks. Also, the guns are taken for just a year. A gun rights group says the law is being used sparingly and that it seems to be working. And this is kind of interesting, Dana. A Duke University study concluded that this law in Connecticut, which was the first to pass it, is preventing 1 suicide for every 20 guns seized.
Oh, that is interesting. All right, Dan, thank you.
Yeah.
2 tech titans facing off. What has Mark Zuckerberg and Tim Cook taking shots at each other? Plus, teachers walking out of the classroom in 2 states will tell you what they're demanding ahead.
Hey, Shepard Smith on the Fox News Desk. Another crazy day for stocks. The Dow plunging after China hiked taxes on more than 100 American products as payback for President Trump's tariffs. And in addition, his, well, attack on Amazon. All the markets are down. The tech sector especially is horrible. We'll keep an eye on the markets as we approach the closing bell. Lots of breaking news today. We'll have it all. Top of the hour on Shepard Smith Reporting. See you then.
Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg is hitting back at Apple's Tim Cook after Cook criticized Facebook for using customer data to sell ads.
The reality here is that if you want to build a service that helps connect everyone in the world, then there are a lot of people who can't afford to pay. And therefore, as with a lot of media, having an advertising-supported model is the only rational model that can support building the service to reach people.
Facebook now faces calls to regulate its platform. Let's bring in Fox Business's Deirdre Bolton. I've always been skeptical of government involvement in the free market, yes. But is everyone inching towards this as a possible solution to the problem?
Everyone is inching towards this as what is potentially going to be the new reality for tech companies. So as we know, Mark Zuckerberg is going to be heading to D.C. He's going to be testifying in front of Congress on April 10th. And the CEOs of Google, or Alphabet, Google, and Twitter have also been invited. So it means basically they have to send someone, if not show up themselves. And it is this discussion of how do they handle privacy. And I think one thing that a lot of analysts pointed out in the run-up to our presidential election is that all of these companies kind of gotten a free pass, meaning they don't have to deal with the FCC requirements that, for example, we do, or a magazine or a newspaper. So there is really a big and growing argument that these companies are really more like media companies than tech companies. So we're in a bit of uncharted territory here in trying to figure out how much do we treat them as media companies, how much do we treat them as tech companies.
But it seems to me that policy-wise and legislatively, including when it comes to cyber terror and things like that, our policy is so far behind the actual technology and where it is.
That is a really fair point. And I mean, you hear this kind of fur flying. Even in Silicon Valley, there is a big discrepancy and in many different opinions and many ranges of opinions. I mean, we heard Zuckerberg responding to the shade, we have to call it that, that Apple CEO Tim Cook threw at him. And, you know, to paraphrase a little bit what Tim Cook was saying, he was saying, oh, well, we have elected not to basically sell our customers' privacy, to which Zuckerberg hit back and said, oh, well, we're doing more than just making fancy toys for rich people, and sometimes poor people need to be connected too. So there's these multi-layers going through it as well of just who these people are serving. So the New York Times published an op-ed piece which is very bluntly actually calling for regulation, and a heavier form of regulation than I've actually seen released in the press, and we can put some of it up. And they're just talking about history. So throughout history, meat packers, credit card companies, just kind of giving this list of saying, in general, you know, we usually fear privacy, but maybe we should not because it may be better for the companies.
Yeah, they're basically saying that regulations are not the wet blanket on the economy that a lot of people are usually concerned about.
However, if you look at these stocks, they're getting killed, and that started when basically this Cambridge Analytica scandal, no other word for it, started for Facebook. So I think investors feel very differently. From an investor's point of view, they're thinking like, oh my God, regulation's the worst possible thing. It hampers innovation. It usually distracts management. I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg, much to his probably unhappiness, has a direct report. He now has probably an entire legal team, an entire compliance team. So it is, if you like, a distraction to doing business as usual. But a lot of people say, listen, they created this situation for themselves by not perhaps having a little bit stricter controls in place in the first place.
Well, they have a little bit more than a week to try to figure out what they're going to say in front of Congress.
Yeah, they do.
All right. Well, we'll keep in touch with you on it. All right. Schools shut down in 2 states as teachers walk out, setting the stage for possible strikes. Where this is happening next. Plus, it's the moment everyone's been waiting for. I know I have. Our service dog in training, Spike, visits the Daily Briefing. He'll be here after the break.
La 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 la, I wouldn't care, but we would stay away from crowds.
Jury selection now underway in Bill Cosby's sexual assault retrial, and experts say the Me Too movement could play both ways for the comedian, making some potential jurors more hostile and others more likely to think men are being unfairly accused. Cosby's first trial ended in a deadlock. The 80-year-old is charged with drugging and molesting a woman at his home in 2004. Last month, a judge agreed to let the jury hear from 5 more women who have accused Cosby. Schools across Oklahoma and Kentucky closed today as teachers hold walkouts for better pay and more funding. These demonstrations coming less than a month after teachers in West Virginia went on a 9-day strike, which ended in them getting their first raise in 4 years. Mike Tobin is live in Chicago with more on the rallies. Mike, in Kentucky, they are demonstrating against pension reform, too.
And the tricky part, Dana, is that pension reform is largely a done deal. Republican Governor Matt Bevin said that teachers there, the very angry teachers, should be grateful for the pension reform that they receive. But really the problem that Kentucky teachers have with this pension reform is the manner in which it was handled. Pension reform was tacked onto a sewage bill, and the way teachers describe it, it was passed like a thief in the night. The head of the teachers union says any lawmaker who voted yes should think about packing up his or her office.
People are angry about the backhandedness, backdoor deals, the corruption in Frankfurt. And if we don't clean up what's happening, then our government is not going to be able to move forward.
Now, the legislation that's moving today is the budget. So the teachers who went to Frankfurt up to the State House here say what they want to do is put pressure on the lawmakers to be certain that they pass a budget that's in the best interest of public education. Dana.
Okay, then, Mike, in Oklahoma, so did the teachers already there get a pay raise from that legislature?
They did get a pay raise, and they're still demonstrating. They asked for $10,000. They got $6,100. The catch is that Oklahoma teachers are 49 out of 50 in terms of teacher pay, and funding for schools has been decreasing, they say, steadily over the last decade. So they want more pay, and they want better supplies to teach the kids.
Some folks say, you got that pay raise. What more do you want? Well, I'm going to tell you what more we want. We want a good school that every student deserves. That's what we want.
And all of this inspired by the West Virginia teachers who walked out for 9 days and ultimately got a 5% pay increase. Dana?
It's interesting to listen to all of that. All right, Mike Tobin, thank you.
You got it.
So the wait is almost over. Our service dog in training, Spike's first visit to the Daily Briefing. You're going to meet him next.